Okay, good afternoon and good morning, depending on the time zone where you are located today. We are very happy to welcome you to the eighth edition of the Global Pension Program and also to the third day already of our parallel sessions related to behavioral pension economics. Buenos días y gracias por sumarse a la octava edición del programa de pensiones de este año. Este es el tercer día también de nuestras paralelas que son relacionadas con economía del comportamiento y pensiones. The sessions will be in English today, so I will advise you, if some of you needs translation to Spanish, you can go to the bottom of your screen and you will see an icon that says interpretation. Okay, so there you can choose the language. La sesión de hoy va a ser en inglés. Para los que necesiten interpretación, pueden ir a la parte baja de la pantalla de las opciones de Zoom y ahí podrán seleccionar el idioma de su preferencia. During the presentation this afternoon, your mics and your cameras are going to be switched off, but we have a Q&A section also at the bottom of the screen. So we encourage you to send us the questions using this option. Depending on how many questions we have, we will be able to manage a certain amount depending on the time we have. But please feel free to send us, and I encourage you to send us all the questions you may have. So my name is Paulina Granados Zambrano. I am both the executive secretary of of IOS, that it is the International Association of Regulators of Pension Funds. And also I am the head of research of the Pension Regulatory Authority in Chile. And most importantly, I will be the moderator of this session today. Before we start, we are making a little quiz to know who you are, okay? Where are you working from, or what is your affiliation? So a little screen will pop up and we will ask you to select. It's popping out already. Okay, here it is. So what is the role you play in your country? Okay, that's the question. So please answer, and we will take a moment to see the results. This is mainly for you, Amy, to give you a hint of what it is the audience you have today. Here it is. Okay. So we wait for the results to pop up. Ready? Okay, so we have 46% of people working in the public sector, followed by private sector, academia, and some other people working for non-profit organizations. Okay, Amy? Thank you so much. So now I will introduce our speaker today. Amy Underwood leads the behavioral economic function at Nedbank, which is based in South Africa, and she is completing her doctorate at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Over the past decade, she has worked across investment banking, investment management, insurance, employee benefits, pensions, and retail banking, and she's deeply passionate about how scientific principles can improve financial decision-making. Prior to starting her professional career, she completed her master's degree at the University of Cambridge. She's also a Commonwealth Scholar, a CFA charterholder, and a fellow of the Young African Leadership Initiative. Amy, today it's in Johannesburg, so we are very happy to have this very open to the world session today. Amy, please, the floor is yours, if you can share your presentation.
Thanks so much, Paulina. Just pulling that up now. There we go. Is that coming through?
It's perfect. Go ahead.
Perfect. It's so lovely to be with all of you today with such an international audience. I'm here in the evening in South Africa, but I believe many of you in the afternoon or the morning where you are. And what's I think is what for me was such fun in preparing for this was that it's an audience where there's a lot of sections on behavioral in the conference. And that means that I can diverge from the normal fare of behavioral for when it's very new to people and play with something that I hope will be a little bit more fun today. I'm going to use South Africa as a case study. The purpose is not to get you up to speed on how the South African pension system works, but just to give you some examples and ways of illustrating the various theories and ways of thinking that I'm going to refer to. It's very applied, very much from a practitioner point of view, but I think you'll see I was kind of hoping for this kind of audience split, so you'll see in the structure sort of where the different pieces fit together. And the key thing I'm talking about today is the pensions decision-making value chain. Because I think what can often happen in behavioral finance is that we jump straight into a specific behavior we're not happy with. People are not saving enough, or people are choosing the wrong investment funds, or there's a problem with, the investment managers have all these biases. We jump into really specific questions really quickly and try to solve them using behavioral methods. And what I wanted to do today is kind of really take the lens out a little bit and go, where do these decisions come from? What is the chain of decisions that get made before we end up in that issue? Because sometimes maybe we have a decision that's been given to the wrong person or could be structured in a different way. And so I'm hoping that having a bit of a split audience with kind of some government and some private sector, this will hopefully give you food for thought from a couple of different areas. And my contact details are here. I know speakers always say this, and I'm never sure if they're serious, but please feel free to contact me if this sparks anything interesting for you that you'd like to discuss further. So how I've broken up the decisions, and the way I've broken them up is inherently arbitrary. It's just to give it a bit of structure. So what I've broken it up into is meta decisions, which is really that regulatory level. When you're thinking about all the different ways a pension fund system could be created, and who is that going to empower to make what decisions? And what are the implications of those different choices from a decision-making perspective? And then the second layer is choice set. So this is typically what I'm talking about here is when something is now perhaps in the hands of an employer or financial services provider, and they're now structuring and setting up choices for individuals that are made at this kind of really detailed level of how much you're going to save, what are you going to put it into, how much you're going to take out, when are you going to take it out. And the three concepts from behavioral science that I think are really useful at this, when you're working at this layer of decisions and decisions about decisions. The one is path dependency. And so this is the idea that the decisions we've made in the past and the current state of play limit your ability to move to just a perfect situation. And I think this is really important in emerging markets, because on the one hand, emerging markets have a lot more wiggle room. They have more space from a regulatory perspective than sometimes developed markets to change things. But those initial steps, whatever direction you've made them in, or even if you have nothing, and your starting point is nothing, there'll always be someone who's making a profit or benefiting from that situation. And how is that going to shift when you start to try and move the system in a better direction? The second piece is social narratives. And these are kind of the beliefs of different parts of the system around pensions, specifically in this case. Obviously, social narratives can be applied to anything. But I think what's important here in terms of social narratives is when you get into pensions and you get into finance, there's often this belief that this is a very rational space. If all the role players in the space are super rational. So even if human beings are not very rational, people in finance, people in pensions, they're rational. But they're not always rational, and there often are powerful social narratives that we need to question in these different layers. And then the third is information asymmetry. So really going back to the market for lemons. How much do different role players know, and is anyone using that against other players? And all of these three things can really limit the ability to improve the system to a perfect outcome. But this is where my concept that I have here is around decision-making guardrails comes in. Is if there are decisions in the system, and sometimes you can't fix the system all the way, how do you put guardrails in to at least make sure that, very colloquially, people can't blow up their lives, which in pensions can happen. So if I start with this question of, and I start with kind of the case study I'm using today just to give you an illustration. When we talk about South Africa, pensions don't add up in South Africa, but in some ways there's an argument that they should. And the reason why someone might argue that they should is for an emerging market, South Africa is considered to have a relatively high level of financial sophistication. We have a relatively deep derivatives market, and so it's considered quite financially sophisticated. We don't have issues in South Africa that the rest of our continent have in terms of credit not being available, insurance products not being available. These markets are fairly big in South Africa. It's a fairly sophisticated emerging market. The second thing is when they did research on social security, when our government did research back about almost 10 years ago, they found that South Africa had the highest ratio of pension fund assets to GDP in the world. So there's a lot of assets in the system. So for a funded system, there's a lot of money there, which should suggest that you could get good results. And then the third piece is that we have historically very high equity market returns, which are often a significant component of pension fund returns. And I've given a statistic there, but I think something that really struck me when I was doing my CFA is in the third year, in the textbook, they specifically singled out South Africa and New Zealand as having some of the highest long-term equity market returns in the world. All of these things should be supportive for pensions and pension outcomes. And yet, the replacement ratio, so the ratio from people's income just before retirement to just after, is typically at about 32%. And that's even an overstated figure because that's a figure from a company called Alexander Forbes who is looking at those who have a pension, which isn't everyone, which is what I'll get to in a second. So that is overstated in terms of the level of protection it is. So the question is, this is not adding up. And I won't go into the specifics of why South Africa is not adding up, but I think it's an important question to always ask at the outset, is whatever country you are in, and I hope you're thinking about a specific country you're in as we go through this, rather than trying to learn about South Africa, see how it applies in your world. But do things add up? Is it adding up to people having the pensions they need when they retire? And then the other question that's so challenging in emerging markets are, does the individual even care? Often when you look at developed markets, pensions can be considered an employee benefit. They can be considered something that is worth working for a certain employer for. They can be seen as something valuable to vote for. In emerging markets, that's not always the case. And certainly in South Africa, three of the big contributing factors for us why people go, oh, why is this money coming off my paycheck? Is often around three things. Firstly, the expectation that they won't live to retirement. Life expectancy in emerging markets can often be significantly lower. In South Africa, we've specifically had the epidemic of AIDS and HIV, and that did lower our life expectancy for quite a protracted period, which has anchored expectations of life expectancy on the low side. The second thing is developing countries can have much higher levels of social capital, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in parts of South Asia. And what I mean by that is there can be a fairly realistic expectation that children will look after their parents in retirement. Now, this isn't always true and this isn't always realistic, but there are emerging markets where it is. And in these cases, people are going, well, why do I need to save? I put my money into my children's education instead so that they can support me in old age. And then the third reason, obviously, in emerging markets that this can be a tension is because the needs of today are often so much more critical, so much more felt at a basic level than they are in developed markets. And all of these can mean that often, even if the system's not adding up to something that really serves people, people don't necessarily care. And so it makes emerging markets interesting. So when we look at meta decisions, the key things I want to highlight here is there's a range of ways you can go. And these decisions made at this level are often, they will determine what opportunities there are for decision making and who's going to have those opportunities in the rest of the value chain. And so if you look at something like a pay-as-you-go system, pay-as-you-go system is a relatively simple system. There's really generally quite a few decisions that are being made by policymakers, and then it's set up and it's go. It's pretty straightforward. It doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't come with its own problems, but from a decision-making perspective, it's relatively contained. Funded systems are much more distributed. DB funds will often be less distributed. DC funds are highly distributed from a decision-making point of view. And this opens up all these spaces for things to go wrong or go right. When we're looking at meta decisions, and that's why I was so pleased to see we have so many people from government today, these are typically made by people who are looking at the end retiree through the lens of a citizen. And so that's a very specific lens that they're looking at the individual through in terms of this. But it raises all these other questions when you're looking at an emerging market. Who is trusted? In some emerging markets, the state is trusted, in others it's not. Similarly, that balance between the market and the state can be really different in different emerging markets. Who do people trust? Do people trust their pension fund to be in the hands of the state, or do they trust it to be in private hands? What is the narrative in a specific country? The second piece that can be big in this decision is if you're going for a pay-as-you-go system, can you afford it? And that's not just based on the size and development of your economy, it's also the complexity of a tax revenue system to collect. And the other thing that complicates this for emerging markets is, do you have sufficient investable assets for a funded system? Something that happens in quite a lot of African countries is that the markets are really small. And what happens is that when you have these pension fund assets coming reliably into the system on a regular basis, is that it creates a very volatile exchange where companies can easily get significantly overvalued because the assets don't have anywhere else to go. And that can create a lot of complexity for the system. On the other hand, it can be a bit of a balancing game. In behavioral finance, we often talk about home bias as a bad thing. It's problematic when people just want to invest at home. But this is complex in an emerging market scenario because the reality is people retire in the country that they would typically have been employed in. And if that country has collapsed, it doesn't matter what the pension fund returns were. The person can end up in a bad situation. And a very local example for us here is Zimbabwe, which in the 1980s had a very sophisticated pension fund system, partially imported from South Africa. They were flying. They had amazing returns. The amount that had to be invested locally was pretty low. They had good managers who were getting great returns. Then the economy and specifically the currency itself collapsed. And the result of that was that people who had saved for many decades, when they retired, could not afford a can of Coke because it didn't matter how well the returns had been if the economy itself collapses. Now, any economy collapsing is always a complex thing, but it does raise these interesting tensions in an emerging market context. Specifically in South Africa, for the purposes of our case study, how our system works is we have a means-tested state old age pension. So that basically is the government, so it's a pay-as-you-go system, and it's really based on ameliorating the worst effects of poverty. So if I give it an international level, it's about $150 a month. So what that means in an emerging market is that you can't, you're probably going to be living in an urban area like a township, is what we would call in South Africa. In Brazil, it would be a favela, called slums in other parts of the world, or potentially in a rural area. You can't, that's not going to sustain you at the level, the quality of life that you potentially would have had as an employed person. So it's not really an option for employed individuals. For employed individuals, there's two things that may come into effect. The one is compulsory savings at the discretion of the employer. So many large employers, including the state, have made savings compulsory in either a DB or a DB-DC structure. Typically in the government, it's a DB structure, and in the private sector employers, it's a DC structure. And but these compulsory savings that many companies have are not required. There is no legislative requirement for it. It is simply, to go back to the concept of path dependency, a choice that got made somewhere by these big firms to introduce them, and now they exist. But it's not required. So it's very easy for even listed large South African companies to not offer a pension at all. So just give you a sense of where we have some gaps in our system. The other thing you can do is go directly to the financial services industry and take out your own policy or account specifically with the industry. But you get a sense of how that's a system with a lot of different decision makers and a lot of different gaps that have been left in it. Then if we go down a level, so I've illustrated an example above in terms of if you're an employed person and you are looking at and you have pension options, typically you're either going to be interacting with a financial services company or with your employer. And they're going to be seeing you through the lens of an employee or a beneficiary or maybe a client. And that's typically the lens they're going to see you through when making these decisions for you. They're typically going to have to set up the fund itself and make the decisions around what is available and what is possible for the individual in that specific pension fund. So the regulators created the structure of what the funds look like. The financial services and employers then create the structure of the fund itself. So something that's really common in South Africa, and I'd be interested to know if it's something you've seen in the markets you operate in, but we have a lot of decision-making committees. And there's a couple of reasons why these committees exist. The one is kind of this idea that you can then create a higher level of responsibility. So if you are talking about the financial services companies, you create this committee that exists for the pension fund. And then even though those are employees from the pensions company, which is a profit-making institution, the fund itself is not, and those people are considered to have a fiduciary responsibility. Obviously, it depends on your regulation in different countries whether you would have fiduciary responsibility, but that's a context that's been used in South Africa, is trying to create these committees, trying to create this fiduciary structure to separate these interests so that whether it's the employer or the financial services company, the decision is not just being made from a profit-making end. There's someone who is responsible for the outcomes for the individual. But does it always work out the way we want? So it's a complex space because we know that there are big risks in group decision making. And one of my favorite books that I've read recently about this is Cass Sunstein's How Change Happens. And one of the concepts that he talks about in there that I think is particularly important is the idea of group polarization. And that basic idea is saying that groups will often make far more extreme decisions than the same individual. So if you take, say, 10 individuals on a committee and you ask them secretly what their opinion is on whatever it is, and then you take the average of that opinion, that will often be much closer to a moderate position than the position that the group makes. And that's because groups have these feedback systems that can really, from a behavioral perspective, make confirmation bias much, much worse. And all these other types of biases where people are trying to believe that they know the truth about the world. And so group decision making is prey to many issues. So while they can appeal to our idea of, okay, let's give these people responsibility, let's allow them to tailor it for the specific circumstances that they are in, let's have them represent the people, the specific group that they are protecting. And these are all really good principles. In practice, from a behavioral perspective, there are significant risks in group decision making that can make outcomes worse. The other piece we have in the South African system, and this is again an opportunity for you saying, do you have these kinds of role players in your system, is we have a lot of advisors. And the one set of advisors that are quite common are advisors into the employer committees. And these come into two basic shapes and forms. The one is a type of advisor who's essentially a fund manager, and they're essentially going to make their money by you giving them the pension fund money to invest, and then they're going to get a slice of that, whatever their fee is, and that's their fee structure. The other group of advisors are kind of more pure advisors or pure asset consultants, and they are typically receiving a fee. Now, many of the diversified pension funds companies in South Africa, including a few for which I have worked, have both types of advisors. And the idea is whatever a committee is comfortable with, we have it. But these advisors have different incentives. And one of the typical things that we've seen in South African context is that the model that has individuals coming in and getting a fee, and they have no stake in the game in terms of which fund manager you choose, are typically much younger and is seen far more as an entry position into the investments world. Whereas individuals who come in as advisors from asset managers or multi-manager funds are often far older, far more experienced, have been in the industry much longer. And you can imagine how when you're looking at a committee, when you have this young 20-year-old on the one hand and this old 50-year-old who's been in the industry for 40 years on the other hand, who are you going to take seriously? And so there's a lot of dynamics that come into this advisor space. And then often these advisors are creating choice architecture. And have they even heard of it? One of the examples in one of my previous employers is we had a period, and I was in the R&D team, and there was a period where one committee after another kept choosing this incredibly obscure fund manager. We were trying to work out what had happened. Why had they suddenly become so popular? They hadn't been advertising. They weren't one of the big names in the industry. What was happening? When we investigated, we discovered that when the packs were put together for the committees, there was a specific table where all the different options were listed. And lo and behold, this specific asset manager was on the left-hand side. It was the very first column. And so there, the choice architecture, where the choices were presented, were affecting the committee that are fiduciaries, that are supposed to have experts, that have advisors advising them, and still their choices were heavily influenced by how the choices were presented. So they're not even aware enough of choice architecture to pick it up for themselves, let alone are they thinking about it when they pass it on to individuals. The other layer of advisors we have very commonly in South Africa, and you may have, is when individuals are dealing directly with financial services company, they will often have an advisor. And that will often come there. South Africa would be doing quite a lot of work to improve those remuneration structures. But again, it creates a whole lot of incentives. Whose interest is the person giving advice? And then the final layer, which is the layer we often spend a lot of our time, is in the decisions themselves. And the two key things here, often the kind of big concepts here, are what are the defaults? So what is going to happen if I don't make a decision? And one of the famous examples of that is if you have an employer and what they automatically do is put you in the pension fund, then you're going to get a very different result than if you have to actively tick a box saying, yes, I want to be part of the pension fund. You get very different results. So that's an example of a default. And then the other piece is choice architecture. So how the choice is presented. What do people see? Now, in this layer of decision making, the person that they're making the decision for is the future version of themselves, which in many ways you should think, oh, we should make wonderful decisions for ourselves. But if you spend any time in behavioral finance, you'll know that future me is often not someone we're particularly good at making decisions for. In fact, in some neuroscience studies, they found that when many people, when they think about their future self, the same part of their brain lights up as if they were thinking about a stranger. And we see it also in hyperbolic discounting, present bias. All these concepts really speak to the fact that making decisions for future me can be a problem. So some of the specific examples from South Africa where these come into effect is, for instance, in South Africa, it became very popular for a long period of time for cash to be the investment fund default in many investment funds. There's a similar example about that. I'll take you through the case study in just a second. But the second piece that can be really big is what are the range of contribution options? And what I mean by that is what is the list of options the person has on how much they save? So in South Africa, you'll have one employer where that list of options of how much people can save is 2%, 4%, 6%, and 8%. Then you'll have a second employer and the options are 17, 19, 21, and 23%. Those lists aren't even overlapping, but the individuals employed in each of those companies will consider whatever's lowest as a low amount to put into savings for retirement, and whatever's at the top to be highest, even though they're totally different figures, 8% on the one hand and 23% on the other. And both of them will think that those decisions have been made by someone who knows what the right answer is. And so it's really, really easy if you are in this employer that you could go your whole life saving and think you're doing the responsible thing. You chose 8% and get to retirement and not have enough. I can tell you from in terms of the South African context, typically what you need to save is more on the 17, 19% side of the spectrum with our inflation and returns patterns. So that's an example of how if that decision at that higher level has been set wrong, how it can affect this individual. And then the question is, if you're one level up, so if you're in government, can you constrain those choices so that the choices that come down to the individual cannot blow their life up like that? And then the other piece where I noticed I've done a bit of a wording thing, but how easy is it to withdraw money? So one of the gaps we have in South Africa is that when you move employers, you can remove your pension fund from the system. And even though this is taxed really heavily, it's a really common option of gap that can be really problematic. So now if I take, I've given you a bit of a sense of those different layers of decisions, I want to give you a couple of quick examples of how these different concepts of path dependency, social narratives, and information asymmetry can play out in practice, and specifically what one can do to create guardrails to protect people from blowing their lives up. So one of the examples that I think is kind of an interesting one is we have a regulator that particularly around 10 years ago started taking a really active interest and employed a lot of really competent people who came in and they were like, okay, we're going to fix the South African system and we're going to put all these different things in place. And one of the specific things they were looking to fix was this idea of cash and specifically what kind of defaults, especially in terms of investment options, are often. There were often cash funds in South Africa, and the other one that's even a little bit more interesting is a lot of them were hedged funds. So they made heavy use of derivatives, and they did that to create a floor so that the value of the pension fund couldn't fall. And the reason why this happened, and there is some truth to this, and then there's a whole layer of social narrative, is if you talk to many people in the pensions industry in South Africa, most people know someone who knows someone that typical urban myth structure. They know someone who, in a mining company, when the retirement fund value went down from one year to the next, the pension fund committee was held hostage by employees that were angry about it. And this is kind of one of the urban myths, but it speaks to a larger narrative, which is the story around the fact that it's an emerging market, incredibly low financial literacy, people don't understand market volatility, very hard to address in an emerging market because you're talking about a country in which, if you look at our literacy scores, they're not particularly good. Basic literacy, numeracy, very, very low from a global perspective. So how on earth do you then go to, oh, by the way, markets go up and down when the pension's involved? And so there is this strong social narrative and around the fact that, people will not accept, employees will not accept if their pension fund value goes down, and they'll get violent. And that's the social narrative. And there's some truth to it, and there's some urban myth to it. And then when we combine it with path dependency, the key thing is if you think about a pension fund that's been using hedging specifically to keep the value, there is someone making a lot of money from that. Derivatives have a lot of margin in them. And so the challenge you get is when, as a regulator, you want to come in and you want to fix this, which is a very valid thing to fix. You suddenly have huge pushback from the industry. And it's really difficult to distinguish how much of this is coming from real, genuine concern around the fact that people don't understand the volatility of markets, and how much is coming from, I want to protect my profits that I'm making, because many pension funds companies are full service financial services companies, and another part of that company is making a profit from the derivative. So these things can become really complicated. You're trying to do something that's really intuitive and makes sense. Improve the investment fund default so people invest in something that makes sense for 40 years. You're creating a really good guardrail, and yet you can hit really bad resistance if you haven't thought about the implications of path dependency and social narratives in the market. Another example that's kind of about passive and really isn't about passive is about when passive funds were introduced in South Africa. And passive is an interesting thing in emerging markets. The best of times, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. So you remember that I mentioned that employed individuals could be getting their investment, their pension funds directly through a financial services company or through their employer. Now, as maybe something that makes a lot of intuitive sense, the fees, if you're going through an employer, are significantly lower than if you're going directly to the financial services company. And it's a pretty straightforward thing when you think about the bargaining power involved. Now, the key thing that happened when passive was introduced is that many of the advisors that were in the market and were promoting passive for their companies, these new passive companies in the market, would highlight the fees that were charged here, where typically the gap between active and passive was 2 or 3%. So really substantial in terms of long run returns. But in this market, if you were going through your employer, that gap was really small. It was kind of a typical gap of what you would expect between passive and active. But what happened is the advisors from these firms were running around and using these numbers in conversations with employers that weren't accurate. And I mean, I know some of the people certainly in South Africa, and I can tell you it was not necessarily a conspiracy. I knew people who used to say these things completely earnestly. They absolutely believed that they were telling the truth, that these were the fees people were paying in these big employer pension funds, but they weren't. And that's the complexity with information asymmetry, is it's not just you have financial literacy, you don't have financial literacy. There are layers and layers of it. And this wasn't even information you would have necessarily if you were a regulator. You needed to be fairly well entrenched in the system and know the different pieces and the pricing mechanisms, because those prices were not the outcome of regulation. Those prices were the outcome of bargaining power in different groups. And so that creates a significant problem in terms of information asymmetries. You can have so many layers of it in a system. And it's really important when you're looking at the system as a whole to not just assume that information asymmetry is the poor individual at the end and maybe the evil financial services company. There are layers and layers in between, and all of them can create issues in terms of getting to the outcome you want in a system. The third example, and this is my slightly controversial one, the pictures at the bottom are from when I Googled the word cultic symbols. I don't know what any of them are, and I mean cultic CU, not CE. So I don't know what any of them are. I think they're all very pretty. So if you know what they are, please feel free to tell me. What I think is kind of interesting, and what I want to poke at a little bit here, is this idea that in financial services, we have the sense that everything's super, super rational. And yet we see a really strong role of social narratives in investment fund managers. You know, this can be as simple as the active versus passive, but it can be value versus growth. It can be momentum versus contrarian. There can be all these different philosophies. And maybe this happens in your market. It's certainly something that happens in ours, is that people go into firms where they already feel like the investment philosophy is kind of correct. And what happens if we look particularly at Sunstein's work and this layer that he brings out and highlights, and a lot of research has been done in terms of group polarization, is that investment firms can become incredibly polarized groups. And if you, so they're all reinforcing this idea that whatever our philosophy is correct. And the other thing you often see in investment management in South Africa, perhaps overseas, I'd be interested to hear in other markets, is that investment managers often stay in firms for really long periods of time. In banking, people move a lot in South Africa. They're constantly moving between banks. Investment managers, people stay for 20, 30, 40 years. And if you have really long tenure of individuals in an investment firm, the chances are they're going to become more and more entrenched in a specific investment philosophy and believe it's more and more rational. And kind of really, this is an anecdotal example, but if you've ever worked across two firms or you know people in different firms, I'm sure you'll be able to think of your own anecdotes in this space. And I'd love to see some quantitative work on it. I think it'd be fascinating. But I remember when a good friend of mine, he moved from a deep value manager. We'd been having fights for years, and he was always like, no, it's all about deep value. Deep value is the way you ignore the benchmark. It's not about the benchmark. And then for various reasons, he needed to move, and he went to a firm, and at the time, I knew the investment philosophies of both firms really well, and this was a firm which had a very different investment philosophy. And their investment philosophy was that you really make active decisions about when you hug the benchmark, when you deviate from the benchmark, which is a totally different philosophy. The question is always, be with the benchmark, don't be with the benchmark. And this huge disjuncture that he went through in the first 3 to 6 months when he was there, because he went from an environment full of highly intelligent people saying this was correct, into an environment of highly intelligent people saying something completely different was correct. And this is one of the things that can be really entrenched in different investment fund managers and even in advisory firms. And it's often not questioned. It's often assumed that these narratives are just left inside the firms, and yet they can lead to all sorts of outcomes in the market that can be unquestioned. So it's a little bit controversial to say that investment firms can verge into this cultic kind of space, but I think it can be important to ask these questions around how social dynamics can influence the cultures in firms that are making huge decisions for people. Then I have a short clip I'm going to show you, which is an example of where there is significant information asymmetry in the South African market. There's a specific product we've been working on, and I'm not advertising a product. I just think it's a fun example of resolving that asymmetry. So let me see if this works. If it doesn't, I will just. It's not super important. I just think it's quite a nice case study in terms of it. It's quite a cute video in terms of ways of explaining pensions. Is it running?
We cannot see it, Amy. Enrique, can you help with that? No, Amy, we can see only the PPT. We cannot see the YouTube. No, Amy, I'm sorry, we cannot see the video.
Is it not working?
Send me the link and I will show it instead of you.
It's not too serious. I can give you the basic concept of it, and then you can click through and watch it. Why I like it is the first layer of why I like it is that it uses a very simple metaphor of coffees, different types of coffees to explain different types of annuities. And basically what it does is, I think in many markets, you often have this contrast where you have one type of annuity which is pretty much guaranteed for life. And you kind of set it up, and then typically what will happen is when you die, there's no money that passes on to anyone else in your family. Then you have what we call a living annuity, but this is an annuity that remains invested and people withdraw from essentially invested funds each year. This passes to any heir directly, fully. And what we see typically in South Africa is that there is a strong preference when people retire for this highly flexible, we'll give all the money to their heirs when the person dies type of option. But the older people get, and this is that whole thing around future me, the older people get, the more they wish they'd chosen this guaranteed form of annuity, because they'll often overdraw down on this, and this creates a lot of issues. And a key issue that's happening there is that we're not really good at projecting our future preferences. There's also a bit of a social narrative piece, which is the belief in the market that when you don't inherit it, when no one inherits any money, it means the financial services company stole it from you, which can be a strong belief and perception. And so, because I mean, annuities, pretty complicated thing to explain at the best of times. But that's the social narrative piece, but there's all this information asymmetry about how these different pieces work and how they fit together. And what this product essentially was built to do was essentially, at the beginning, it looks like this, and over time you can turn it into this. But it's not it's basically taking away that binary decision where at the beginning of retirement you choose this road or that road, and then you live with the consequences. The idea here was to say, we know people prefer this riskier option. How do we now create the space for them to change this decision as they age? And essentially, as I say, what it does is, as people get older and they go, yeah, actually, I would rather have more now and less for someone to inherit, it converts the money into more and more guaranteed income. And what this does is, from a behavioral perspective, is it's a decision-making guardrail. So what we specifically do in this piece is, so there's the video, which is one behavioral piece explaining in terms of coffee. Then the second piece is having graphs and tables where people can move the numbers around and see what happens during decision making. And what we see is, even in 30 minutes, many people will go from, yes, my kids must inherit everything, to, damn, my kids, I need a higher income for me now. And they'll make that shift during the period. So they'll go from, say, like 100% preference for inheritance to, say, 80%. But then what the product does is, they can't ever move up, but they can always move down, which means they can always move to a more and more guaranteed position, which exactly matches how preferences change while people are in retirement. And so that, for me, is an example you can look at of a decision-making guardrail that replicates and embeds the normal preferences and biases and how they evolve over time directly into what the person is investing in, so that you can protect them against the worst possible decision, which certainly in South Africa is typically that people run out of retirement savings within 5 years of retiring. And that is that is what I have to say. I'm just closing on this so that you can see that if you have particular questions about the different pieces.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy. Amy, I have the video. If you let me to show it, would be nice. If you can share, okay?
We can. I mean, it's quite a fun video.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, if there's questions as well, we can also jump to questions. I need to stop.
Okay, so we jump to questions. Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Amy. Very interesting. I think it's very useful, this slide you are showing now, because it sets very well what are the chain of decisions you have to take, or you have to make to properly understand any problem, any policy you want to apply. We have some questions that I will start with this one, that I think it is related to the level 1 of what you presented today, the meta decisions. It's difficult, a tricky question, I would think. I would say. So the question is, what to do when the main authority lacks the knowledge or the ability to determine these meta decision goals. That I think it's something that happens a lot in emerging countries. If you can develop about that.
Absolutely. I don't think there's a simple solution for that. I think that certainly, I mean, if I look at the South African case study, if we go back in history, I think a lot of our original regulation was basically created by financial services companies saying, do this, we want this. And slowly having more and more informed individuals employed in the emerging in the states, and specifically 10 years ago they really invested in bringing people in. And one of the challenges is that you have this path dependency issue, is that if you set the initial legislation up in this kind of way that wasn't really well thought through, you can't now jump, which there was a little bit of an attempt to do in South Africa and then they had to rethink it. You can't jump now from what is a problematic system to the perfect system, because as soon as you have a problematic system, there are going to be interest groups that basically rise up, make profits, get benefits from the specifics of whatever that system is, even if it's problematic. I mean, I think when there isn't enough information, I think today we are luckier. There are some really nice World Bank frameworks and these kind of big centralized frameworks that I think one can borrow a lot from. I mean, I remember the first time I saw the World Bank framework, and the gaps in South Africa were so obvious from one slide. And I was just like, oh, if we'd thought it through like that, like these big, I think it's pillar 1 that South Africa is missing. And it's very obvious because you can see immediately, oh, we have pillar 0, that's the state piece. And we have, the piece that the industry does, it's pillar 2, but we're missing pillar 1. So I think that's always, I think emerging markets today that have maybe nothing are in a better situation than they would have been 30, 40, 50 years ago, because there are these strong frameworks globally to work from. I think, the other option is always to look at neighbors who have maybe more advanced systems, especially if they're a larger neighbor and they maybe have stronger states with more individuals with information. But it is a really big problem. I mean, I think what can work is what is useful. I do think the World Bank stuff is really useful, because if you at least start with that and you don't get too complex or too technical, it's almost like a decision-making guardrail for governments. If I use the language that I've used in this, is it kind of gives you a bit of a space, it gives you a bit of a starting point that you don't have to be a super technical expert, and you won't leave massive gaps that you'll have to fix later. And I do think it's a huge problem, but certainly my kind of top of mind thing would be, and I mean, certainly because we work into Africa, and so we see it quite a lot. I mean, what happens on our continent is often people adopt South African stuff, blended sort of with World Bank, because we are a big market. But I definitely think that starting with those big World Bank frameworks, and as I say, it's like you don't even need the really detailed stuff, just the basic framework that they have immediately. It is a decision-making guardrail. It does mean you can't miss something massive.
Yeah, indeed, I totally agree with you. It's very difficult to solve. And related to this question, it's okay. Let's say we have level 1 meta decisions, level 2 choice heads, fine, settled. But then how we deal with all the influence that can make people to decide wrongly, let's say. The person that said, for example, populism, media, I don't know, the parties, many things that many actors that can, even if everything is settled, you decide wrongly. So if you can tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one again, but I mean, if I look in South Africa, I mean, one of our very influential groups that have done some really good stuff with pensions and, some different stuff is kind of labor unions. So one of the interesting things we had happen was when there was a change being made to the private sector regulation that didn't affect public employees at all, because the regulations are separate in South Africa. They were making a change over here, but because of how it was messaged by some specific labor unions, these people started striking. And so, like, a simple piece of information is misrelayed, and it can really trigger a huge amount of problems at that individual decision-making layer. I think this is where guardrails, the concept of guardrails, is really, really important. If you are operating at level 1 and level 2, it's super important to try and think about what is the worst case scenario and how do you prevent it? So if the worst case scenario is someone doesn't save at all, what do you need to put in place to make sure that isn't possible? If you have a funded system, for instance, obviously pay as you go is a different type of thing, but funded tends to have more of these decision-making points. How do you make that impossible? Do you make a rule that says if you're at a meta level, you say when you're setting the choice sets, you cannot set a savings level below 15%, because that's what's correct for South Africa. You can set anything you want above, you cannot set it below. And I think sometimes it's really important you can't think of everything, and you can't project all the things might happen in your market and your economy for the next 40 years, but you can normally think of the worst case scenarios. And I think it's really important to get rid of them, because the reality is if they're there, they will be chosen. If the wrong decision is on the list, it will be chosen by someone. If it's first on the list, it will be chosen by a lot of people. In South Africa, 70% of all people in employer-funded pension funds choose the investment fund default. 70%, which is why when we allowed cash defaults, it was such a disaster. And that's why, something really disastrous like that, like someone being invested in cash for 40 years, you have to make impossible. Because if you don't, it will happen and it will affect people. And so I think that's really important when we're talking about individuals. By the time it gets to individual level, what you want to do at level 2 and level 3, at level 1 and level 2, is make sure that the really bad decisions are impossible. You want any decision you're putting on the table to be something that will not destroy someone's life. And yeah, because as a behavioral scientist, if it's on the list, someone is going to pick it. But off the list.
Yeah, thank you. So in this question is very specific for pensions, the pension decision, the pension saving decision. How to motivate young people to make long-term savings in emerging countries? You said interesting stuff about that I haven't thought about it. What it is the step, the very big step that can happen between one generation and the other one in emerging countries. That's true. If you invest all in your children, maybe that they will have a much better increase in well-being than you did if you are the parent. But all the issue of the young people in our countries, I'm talking about Latin America. The person that asked is from Mexico, and it says that in Mexico, especially, the youth seems especially be attracted to present income more than future income. In Chile, for example, we had evidence from a survey that says that millennials or the young people between 30 and 40, they do save, but not for pension. They save for traveling. And now we have COVID also. So that is a big shock in the preferences in this specific case. So if you can tell us if you have some insights about how behavioral economics can help the youth to get that conscious.
Yeah, so present bias is a big one in savings, and it is a difficult one in emerging markets because often you have large young populations. We certainly have that in South Africa, and much smaller older populations. And you have all these competing things, and especially, if I think of the Mexico example, Mexico, Brazil, lots of South America share high levels of inequality with South Africa. And the big problem with high levels of inequality, particularly amongst young people, is that it creates this huge need to show that I am from the higher groups, that it goes beyond just the actual needs for the day. And what I think is really important, there's some nice work in the Spirit level. It's not perfect, but it is an interesting piece of work that was done by Kate Pickett, and I'm going to forget his first name, but Wilkinson is the last name, around the effects of inequality. And that can really, I think, make present bias significantly worse. Because it's not just about, we often have this thing in South Africa where they'll say, oh, how do you convince people that live in in the equivalent of a favela or township is what we call it here. How do you convince someone who lives like that they don't need to get their nails done? Surely they don't need to get their nails done. But there's a huge aspect of status anxiety in a highly unequal society that can really fuel present bias in the young generation. So there's a couple of things, and they sound silly, but they can be quite effective. So one of the things they've done to help people bridge the gap between the younger self and the older self is some of these new technologies where they can age a picture, and then they can show you visually like what you look like when you're old, and your brain can recognize it more easily as you. And then you can give the scenario or the example in the context of that picture. Some of the other things they've done is, so these various forms of simulations can be very helpful in helping people to bridge that link pretty quickly. And young people seem to find, I know my sister sends me thousands of pictures of the different old versions of herself. So as someone in the millennial generation, I can say, the stuff is popular. But it is often these kinds of techniques that one needs to use. I think one of the things we have to be aware of, though, is that, and this is why I think the layers of decisions are so important, is that if you've made it possible for people to not save, for retirement, it doesn't matter. You could be in Sweden and they wouldn't do it. It's just that if you're in Sweden, the state's going to look after you when you're old. The pay-as-you-go system is so high that you can't blow your life up in that way. It just doesn't exist. And so I think sometimes we beat ourselves up in emerging markets saying, oh, we're so silly, we're so stupid. Rubbish. You look at the Americans, they often have a much more laissez-faire system. They do the same daft shit, right? It's not like a specific thing that we're making this error because we happen to be an emerging market. People are not good at this. People are not good at thinking about their future. So there are techniques we can use behaviorally to improve decision making, absolutely. But again, it's that point of like, you have to look at the whole decision making value chain. How do you, if you are relying on motivation, and this is one of my huge things in behavioral finance, is a lot of people want to rely on motivation. How do we motivate people to do this? How do we motivate people to do this? It's a really difficult one to do on a consistent way to change behavior. You always want to play on the other paces. How do you make it easy or inevitable, or it's just going to happen in the background, and people kind of can't make a mistake. As long as you're relying on motivation for any kind of behavior change, whether you're talking about someone drinking enough water that day, or changing their diet, or saving for retirement, if you're relying on motivation is the last thing you add. First, you make sure that employers or the state or someone, they need to save, it's required, they're going to grumble about it and be grumpy, but they have to do it. Then when you present the decisions, you can start using behavioral tricks like showing them old versions of themselves, making it, using emotive and affective, so emotional way, like techniques to change how they see the decision once they have to make it. But first of all, you really have to look at those meta decisions, because the idea that motivation can do the heavy lifting is always going to take, it's never going to be enough. It just won't be.
Okay, Amy. Amy, thank you so much. I think I will ask this last question. I think we have 30 seconds left. So that I think is pretty interesting. It's how to reduce the gap between people's information asymmetry and people's decision making. So it is that from your experience, what has been the greatest challenges and time used to reduce this gap?
Yeah, so I suppose the example I gave last is probably a good example of some of the things we've done. Is you have to find everyday metaphors. You need to, there's also a really powerful example, it's from payday loans, but where they just did numbers on small tables and things like that. You have to find ways to convey the information in 30 seconds, which I'm possibly not doing very well now, but it's those everyday metaphors that are super important. You can't give them a CFA, you can't give them an actuarial degree. What you can do is use a really powerful, really everyday metaphor that takes complex information and conveys it exceptionally quickly.
Okay, thank you so much, Amy. So we are closing this session today. Please, Amy, share the screen so we can show our slide for the presentations tomorrow morning. Thank you so much for the questions. Thank you for the participation in this panel. Thank you so much, Amy, for meeting us. And I will remind you that tomorrow we start, let me check, I think at 9 a.m. Yes. And we start with the presentation for behavioral economics and pensions that would be very related to what Amy showed today, specifically for emerging countries in South Africa, from Diego Valero, the Novaster. And then we have Richard Jackson from the Global Aging Institute, who would talk about voluntary savings and non-standard jobs. So we encourage you to come to join us tomorrow at 9 a.m. Washington, D.C. time. And once again, Amy, thank you so much. And I tell to the audience that the videos and the presentations will be available for in the webpage of the course next week. Okay, so thank you so much and see you soon.